values. So there'll be much more detail, but I just want you to keep that in mind when you hear about the WZC, the World Zionist Congress election, that's what it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We got a lot to talk about. And, you know, I'm so honored and also, a little bit anxious about all of our people because I'm not an expert on this. There's so much going on that it's very hard to get a clear picture of where we are. And there are lots of different points of view. So what I want to do is I want to talk I want to organize what I'm going to say in sort of three main areas. And then I want to leave room for questions and so forth at the end. So the first thing I want to talk about is where was Israel on October 6th, 2023? Was Israel particularly vulnerable? What has happened since October 7th, 2023 in terms of Israel's, I would argue, overwhelming success in general, except for hostages, but in terms of military and politics, Israel's in a very different situation than 15 months ago. And third, what's happening now and what happens next? And again, that's the area where there are so many different points of view and really very hard to tell. But let's start. Where was Israel on October 6, 2023? Because all the time, how did this happen? Well, Israeli society was facing a lot of crises. There was the judicial conflict, the judicial reform crisis, in which many people believed that Prime Minister Netanyahu had created unnecessary divisiveness in the country over this sort of radical judicial reform, and that had created tension, and that people were upset, and that also resources were being diverted from watching the Gaza Strip to settlements in the West Bank, and there was a lack of focus on intelligence, and there was just a lot of problems. And we saw that. We saw that there was so much controversy, and that there was kind of internal strain within Israeli society. I know many of you have been to Israel, and you know that Israel is I would say, a very tight-knit, patriotic society. It is. I mean, I think part of that comes from everybody serving in the military, or almost everybody serving in the military. Some of it comes from simply Judaism being not that everybody's Jewish, but it is a Jewish state. So there is a very strong sense of national unity, and it's been essential to Israel's survival. I mean, Simcha could tell us about that. It's been essential to Israeli culture for forever, since the founding of the state, since before the founding of the state. And that people felt that was being lost. Not totally, but there was a lot of division. And that was the situation. And there was just a lot going on in the world. There was the conflict with Ukraine. There was kind of a feeling, at least in Israeli society, that the Palestinian issue had been managed. It was being managed, and that the bigger issue, the bigger questions that needed to be addressed were relationships with other countries in the Arab world. So peace agreements with the UAE and with Dubai, that was the Abraham Accords. So that the focus was on the broader geopolitical context of the Middle East rather than the internal problems within Israel or between Israel and the Palestinians. And that was the situation. And then you have October 7th. And in many ways, and we don't need to belabor this point, it was the worst disaster in Jewish history since the Holocaust. I mean, in fact, somebody pointed out during the recent hostage exchange that nobody had been imprisoned longer simply for being Jewish than the hostages who were just released, than people since the Holocaust. That nobody had been forcibly imprisoned in such a way. That this was I would say, in many ways, an existential October 7th, 2023. Now we can look with a little bit of hindsight. We're 15 months after. We can look and say, essentially, this was the most existential threat to Israel since 1948. Because the Six-Day War was a tremendous threat, but it was over very quickly. And it was a more traditional military conflict. This, what has happened in Israel, the broader Middle East, and the world since October 7th has been shocking and difficult in ways it's hard to imagine before October 7th what the world looks like. I mean, just think about the rise in anti-Semitism. I mean, there was already increasing anti-Semitism, but to see what has happened on college campuses in Germany, in England, I mean, just the kind of vitriol, it was shocking. So October 7th absolutely dramatically reshaped the Israeli psyche. It reshaped a feeling about being Jewish around the world, both for Jews and non-Jews. It shattered a certain kind, I wouldn't call it Israeli hubris or overconfidence. That's too strong a word, but we all have taken comfort. There was always a feeling that Israel is so superior militarily and technologically. And that's true. And that remains true. But that superiority is not invincibility. And that this kind of feeling of protection was really shattered. And it sort of reframed how Israelis see themselves. And that had some very positive consequences in that it created much stronger national unity out of a time of conflict. And there is a much stronger sense of morale. And the hostage crisis has really, it exposed a kind of Jewish vulnerability. You know, today, or just yesterday was Holocaust Memorial Day. And it is that it's very much receding into the rearview mirror. I mean, 80 years, that's just the natural course of time. And October 7th was this kind of revelation of a certain kind of vulnerability. And that has really damaged, but also strengthened the Israeli psyche. Now, what has happened since October 7th, and that's really kind of what I want to sort of focus on, is that Israel and the situation in Israel and the relationship between Israel and America, obviously with the election, has been transformed. So, and I think there are sort of three major examples of this. The first is the destruction of Hezbollah. Israel had always seen, it's not total destruction, but pretty severe destruction. Israel had always seen Hezbollah as the much worse threat than Hamas because they're more sophisticated missiles and so forth. And the destruction of Hamas, of Hezbollah and its leader was so overwhelming and so strong that it ultimately led to the next major thing, which is the fall of Bashar Assad in Syria. Both were sort of fronts for Iran. So that has weakened dramatically the power of Iran in the region. And Israel and Iran had its first and only direct exchange of violence. That had not happened in Israel's 75-year history. And so Israel got the better of Iran significantly. And so while October 7th, 2023 exposed deep weakness, the amount of advancement since then has been extraordinary. Not to mention, I mean, we are in the midst of Hamas is now back in power in Gaza, but it is a decimated Hamas. And so in many ways, Israel is stronger, much stronger than it has ever been. And so that then has led to a kind of question about what is going to happen next. And by the way, it's not just politically either. The way Israel's economy has maintained itself is truly, truly remarkable. I mean, I did doing a lot of research and reading about this. Israel's economy has suffered tremendously. I mean, think of the drop in tourism. There were drops in real estate purchases and so forth. But overall, the economy, it shrank a little bit in the first quarter after the conflict, and since then has continued to grow. Part of it is simply the technology, that Israel is so strong technologically. Some of it is successful fundraising and investments from around the world. Some of it is simply military accomplishments. So the fact that Israel has been able to maintain a strong economy and a fairly decent standard of living through this horrific war is an extraordinary accomplishment. So that has given a lot of confidence and hope. It's very interesting. There is sort of a mixture. I did a wedding, must have been about 2 months ago, and the groom was Israeli and the bride was from here. And a couple of his friends and relatives came in from Israel. So I was talking to them, and I sort of, there was a kind of feeling of depression and anxiety, of kind of like, are we going to have to live with this conflict? Am I, these were kids in their early 20s, mid 20s. So young, but also mature, had served in the army, and a kind of feeling of, am I going to have to be fighting these wars? Are people going to be hating us on our borders for the rest of my life? So there is a kind of anxiety and sort of just cynicism around that, but there's also very strong confidence. So it's an interesting mix. And now with the election of President Trump, and I think I generally know the feelings of our congregation, or at least most of our congregation. But I also do have an idea of the feelings in Israel. My wife's brother lives there. Obviously, I have lots of friends there. I mean, if Trump ran for prime minister of Israel, he would win with 80% of the vote. I'm pretty sure. So that would be that's just the reality. That's maybe not 80%, maybe 70, but extremely popular. So there is a sense of kind of a little bit of hubris, a little bit of overconfidence, and also questioning what happens next. And there are so many different possibilities, so many different possibilities. So what was just controversial in the news just now is the president's comments about, well, essentially clear them out, which is horrific. It's something that's been proposed. It was proposed about 25 years ago. I remember going to Israel, and I can't remember which trip this was. This might have been on this was a trip even before I was ordained as a rabbi. This was a trip with the Cincinnati Jewish Federation back in 2003, 2004, because it was during the Iraq War. It was during the Iraq War. And Israel, if you remember, Israel's leadership was extremely supportive of the Iraq War. Renan Geeson, who was a colonel, and so we actually had a meeting with Geeson and someone from Avigdor Lieberman's party, which was the Russian more conservative party, and they essentially were advocating for resettlement. So this has been going on for a while, but the argument is that Gaza is so annihilated, destroyed. I mean, it's rubble, that the better option would be for Arab countries like Jordan and Egypt, which is directly neighboring Gaza, to build housing and to welcome refugees. And the likelihood of that happening is very little, because first of all, they don't want it. And second of all, how can you? I mean, I am sympathetic to Israel's needs and reasoning, but it would be very hard to uproot people who have, hundreds of years connection to the land. That's just, I mean, we from a moral point of view. On the other hand, one could say that this is what happens when you start a war you can't win. I mean, this is one could make that argument. Not that I think it's the best argument, but this is a real confusing topic. What happens in Gaza now? So that's one kind of far-fetched option, is some sort of resettlement, and what that would then entail is maybe a certain kind of Israeli occupation for a period of time while it's rebuilt, and then some could come home. There are people on the far right who want to rebuild settlements in Gaza. And Gaza, see, the interesting thing about Gaza is, from a historical point of view, it's not very significant. The West Bank is very significant. I mean, from a biblical point of view, you've got, very important graves. It's a very important site in Torah. So the West Bank, there's religious significance. Gaza, there's not much religious significance. So the settlements are less of an issue around Gaza, but they're still an issue. And then there's the question of who governs in Gaza. If temporarily there's some sort of overall Israeli military occupation and rebuilding, what happens next? And I think with the United States, at least now, see, one of the reasons this topic is so difficult is just the almost diametrically different views of the Biden administration and the Trump administration. I mean, they really are. I mean, I think President Biden was obviously very supportive of Israel, but the general focus and future casting of the administrations are different. So what the Biden administration had wanted was eventually for the Palestinian Authority to govern in Gaza. Just like the Palestinian Authority governs the West Bank, Palestinian Authority should govern in Gaza. Now, the problem with that is that the Palestinian Authority is really not well liked by the people because they're very corrupt. It's sort of like, you know, all the money goes to the 1% and the 2%, and the rest of you can live in poverty. And that's sort of the Palestinian Authority. And they're seen by many Palestinians as too cooperative with Israel. So, but then the Israeli right sees the Palestinian Authority as not that much different than Hamas. So the Palestinian Authority sort of has it hard on both sides. I have been reading that, in the first Trump administration, his ambassador to Israel was a guy named David Friedman. And David Friedman's a very interesting, he is a bankruptcy attorney who had worked with Donald Trump on his Atlantic City bankruptcies. But he was also a very, very conservative, sort of Likud-leaning American Jew. His father was a conservative rabbi, but he's a very close, I think he still is a very close advisor to the president. And he wrote a book that was released a couple months ago called One Jewish State. And I read it, and it's a fascinating book. And I think it gives a kind of window into the thinking that is prevalent among the administration and among the people who will shape the Trump administration view towards Israel. I could be wrong, but I think this is generally the focus. And there are a couple of key things about this. First is the two-state idea is pretty much dead. The idea that there will be a Palestinian state, at least in the near to medium term, is very unlikely. Because the idea is, you look at what happened on October 7th, when there was a Palestinian, essentially a functioning Palestinian state at our border. It led to the worst massacre and murder in Israeli history. We have no partner for peace. Security is our biggest obligation. And so it would be committing suicide to allow a Palestinian state. That's the general point of view. And so then, what's the alternative? And as the title of the book kind of illustrates, One Jewish State is this idea that there would be, it is a Jewish state. And this by the way, is a real tension within, forget the Palestinian issue. The idea of a Jewish democratic state is itself a very complex idea. Because if you think about it, democracy means one person, one vote, elections, majority rules, and so forth. But part of a democracy is you protect minority rights, and minorities have the same basic human rights as anybody else. And so from that standard, Israel's not really even a democracy right now, because one religion is privileged, Judaism. Right? The thing, you know, there are definitely preferences for just making aliyah. You can make aliyah if you're Jewish, and that's a certain kind of preference. And this is, by the way, why certain white supremacists often say, hey, well, Israel controls its immigration by saying it's only going to admit Jewish people. So in America, we could control our immigration by saying we're only going to admit white people. This is a very common argument on the alt-right. So there is a challenge in terms of understanding Israel. So the idea of a Jewish democratic state itself is a difficult idea to maintain. Now, so what the situation with right now is, those of you who've been to Israel know that Palestinians are essentially divided into three different groups. There are Arab Israelis who are basically full citizens of Israel. Basically, there are a couple of things. They don't serve in the army. There's certain different, tax and incentives and residency requirements, but all intents and purposes, it's pretty close to being an equal citizen. Then there's the B level that are in communities that are kind of by settlements, and they essentially have B and C communities have very little basic rights. They can't really vote in elections. They don't really have much say in permitting, in basic laws. They're essentially, it's essentially a form of segregation, or not. Apartheid's almost too strong a word, because it's not a separate legal system, but it is there are certain rights that are not afforded to that group. So the argument then is, if we have one state and we want to be one Jewish democracy, how can we do that? Because if we give every citizen of this one state equal rights, then we're no longer Jewish. I mean, that's a pretty big contradiction. So what Friedman says in this book is essentially that this is what he says. He says most Palestinians would be very happy to be basic citizens of Israel, that the quality of life is better, that jobs are better, that basic services are better. And we can approximate democracy in that basically there would be local rule in Palestinian communities. They could elect their own mayors, tax collectors, so forth. It would simply be militarily and security-wise, it would be controlled by the national government, which would be a Jewish state in which only you had to be a certain kind of citizen to vote in that. So it would essentially be a two-tiered democracy. And obviously that creates enormous, his argument is ultimately Palestinians will want this. And it might be hard at first, and there might be a lot of opposition at first, I'm getting out of it, but that ultimately all parties will want this. And of course, if you're trying to create one Jewish democratic state, sending off 1 million to 2 million potential second-class citizens would be a good start if that was your goal. So that is, I think, in many ways, what the direction policy is headed towards. I don't know, but I do think that the idea of two states, which for so long was United States policy, I mean, it goes back, in fact, it goes back to really 1996, 1997. If you actually look, I was doing some, in 1992, Bill Clinton opposed the creation of a Palestinian state. 1992, that was still too far left in Jew, the idea that Palestinians, Yasser, because this was before the Oslo Accords. So the idea of a Palestinian state was too far left. That changed obviously after the Oslo Accords, and that's been basically Western US policy. And now I think we're moving away from that policy, and we're moving towards one Jewish state that may have certain features of autocracy. And that's, I'm sure, worrisome to American Jews. But on the other hand, what alternatives do we have right now? I mean, that's the real, that's the sort of the very difficult question to answer. Israel can't, the current situation cannot persist as it is. And so what does the next 10 to 15 years look like? And I think that's the most likely scenario. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism also. But before that, questions about this. Questions about what happens next in Gaza. Yeah.
What's going to happen in the West Bank?
Can you?
What's going to happen in the West Bank? Well, the West Bank is always, I mean, there's lots of trouble. There are extremist settlers who set fire to Palestinian cars and so forth. And there's a lot of Palestinian angst. And but in general, the West Bank is much more stable than Gaza. I mean, it's manageable. So that's, I don't see anything flaring up there. Yeah.
Do you think that the Palestinians want a two-state solution?
That's such a hard question. The question is, do the Palestinians want a two-state solution? Well, I mean, the surveys would say no. The surveys would say that anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel are absolutely rampant among the Palestinian population. That 80% support what Hamas did on October 7th. Now, that's a very high statistic, but that seems to be the case. So, on the other hand, I think most people just want peace and stability in life, but there are extremists on both sides who continue the conflict. But I do think that there is a deep-seated anti-Semitism within the Palestinian community, and that's part of that is just the culture. Part of it is, I mean, you've probably seen there's lots of studies of different textbooks and things, and Martyr Square, and I mean, who are heroes? People who go and explode themselves. I mean, the culture does matter. It's not everything, but it matters. So I don't know. I wish, I hope, I dream, but yeah. Izzy, go ahead. Yeah.
Piece of all those prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, is going to affect Israel's security, the thousands that are now being used.
Okay, yeah. So the release of prisoners in Israel's security. Well, this is the big catch-22 question. And this is the hostage deal a good deal? And is it good for Israel in the long term? Now, one could make the argument, essentially, that Israel had to do the hostage deal because overwhelmingly the public wants the hostages returned home. The Israeli public is willing to make some sacrifices for hostages to return. So that's one argument that, yes, it may expose Israel to greater dangers, but it's what the public wants, and we'll worry about that down the road. But you could make the argument that even from a military point of view, the hostage exchange is a good idea because part of the reason young Israelis are willing and eager to go serve in the army is that they know if something happens, the government and army will do everything they can to get that person back. So it's kind of a feeling that the culture, the society has your back. And that's a priceless feeling. I mean, to know that someone's always looking out for you and someone's always caring about you can give you greater motivation to go into war. So in a sense, if you're looking at it strategically, there is a value in maintaining that commitment. So I think many of the people, so a guy like David Friedman, who is definitely on the far right, I listened to a conversation with him about the hostage deal. And essentially he says, I absolutely, utterly hate the deal, but I think it has to be done. But again, he doesn't think it's going to get past this first phase, which I think a lot of people don't think it's going to ever reach the second phase, but that's a whole nother discussion. Yes. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about Netanyahu and the feeling of how much some of the responsibility he has in terms of everything that happened. It's a lot that I don't really understand, but I hear about it a lot.
Yeah, I think he's such a fascinating figure. I mean, just purely from just a historical point of view, I think a lot of Israelis do blame him in some ways for what happened on October 7th. I think people realize it could have happened to anybody, but that the Israeli society was so divided, and that he had brought in people into his government who are very far right, and that had created even more division. So I think even one of the people I like to read was a little bit on the conservative side, but I think he's brilliant. Is a guy named Daniel Gordis. He has a great blog on Substack. And he's pretty conservative, but he's no fan of Netanyahu. And he kind of says that, in some ways, Netanyahu is sort of Trumpian in being able to foster divisions and so forth. So that's one part of it. On the other hand, I think many Israelis would say that the war has been conducted very, very well. That since October 7th, that the Israel has done a remarkable job militarily, and also essentially, in some ways, even though there's been so much criticism, Israel has maintained its strong relationship with the United States, even when, you know, even through the election, that diplomatically, Israel has done very well. So people would say that Bibi has preserved that, and that he has sort of really prosecuted the war effectively. That, by the way, is why I think he was able to make the deal, the hostage deal, because I think the far right in the government coalition utterly opposes it, but he has enough influence and political capital to say if they left the government, I could get other people to come join my coalition, and they know that, so they didn't leave the coalition. So in a sense, he's popular enough to get the deal done. So I think he's sort of recovered some of that. It's my view.
But
Yeah.
prior to October 7th, how was he enabling Hamas? Like,
Oh.
that, I guess that, like, what was he doing to mitigate any type of peaceful?
Yeah. So
relationship to begin with?
So his critics would say that essentially he allowed Hamas to keep power because he wanted a foil to avoid two states. So he's going to say, so, oh, you really want two states? Okay, well, they want Hamas. So you want a terrorist group as it, and that he was essentially propping up Hamas by essentially letting them build power. You know, Israel plays a huge role in Palestinian internal politics. So people would say that he's essentially, it'd be kind of like, you know, if you're Donald Trump and you're running against Hillary Clinton, you know, kind of keeping Bernie Sanders alive, you know, like finding a villain, somebody to say, well, that represents the other side. And so I think that is in some ways part of what he did. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's pretty centrally confirmed. Yes.
Could you explain what the B and C groups are that you described and what distinguishes them?
Yeah, I wish I had my notes because there's some serious legal differences. The C group is essentially the group with very little rights that are under almost full military occupation.
So they're the people who are in the West Bank.
Yeah, and Gaza. Well, Gaza now, but yes. So essentially, anybody who doesn't live within the Green Line, within Israel from the 1948 border, those are the A group. Arabs inside the Green Line, they're the A group that essentially have full rights. The B and C groups don't, but the B group has a few more rights. And I don't exactly remember why. I think it's based on where they live, proximity to settlements and so forth. But it's essentially, I mean, it certain groups within the Palestinian community don't have very many rights. And the problem is that's the group that grows the fastest. They have more kids. It's a big demographic. And so how do you manage that demographic if there's only one state? Yeah, it's tough. Okay, well, okay, Sue, and then we'll go around here. Yeah.
I think there, on a US, originally you talked about October 6th.
Yeah.
Was there an intelligence failure that caused October 7th?
Seems to be that there was. It seems to be there was, I think maybe Israel, maybe I wouldn't say it's a failure. Well, it's a failure, obviously, because it happened, but it was sort of things were overlooked. I just read this remarkable book. Let me get the exact title because it's on my Kindle here. It's a phenomenal book by a guy who lived The Gates of Gaza by Amir Tibon. He's a journalist for, I think, Haaretz, and he lived in Nahal Oz, that he lived in that community right on the border. And it was his father was a retired Israeli general, and he's the one who was texting with his father from the room, and the father got out of the ocean or got out of the Mediterranean, went up to his apartment, grabbed his gun, grabbed his wife, and drove to the kibbutz and started shooting. I mean, they're an incredible hero. They were floating in the Mediterranean when they, then they got out and saw these texts from their son. He's a very interesting journalist. And he wrote this book that was released on October 7th, 2024, about his family's experience. And what was the question? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So he talks about how by the kibbutz, there is a group of soldiers, and they're all female. This is a female unit that watches, that watched the fence. And I mean, very serious. And they were sending reports back that there are lots of maneuvers happening right at the border. Hamas is, they were documenting that something unusual is going on. It seems like they're preparing for something. And the Israeli leadership obviously didn't heed that. So,
Didn't believe them because they're women.
yeah, I mean, that's what critics would say. Yeah. So, okay, who else had their hand up? Alan? Yeah.
I'm concerned that you are underplaying the continuing.
That could have been, I think, well, there is really interesting, even on the far right in Israel, there's a kind of a little bit of fear of Trump too. If you read between the lines of that, I've been doing a lot of reading because I saw that 70, 80 people were coming tonight. I said, I got to know my stuff. So there is a feeling that Trump may really want a Nobel Peace Prize, which I'm sure he does, and that may be willing to, according to the far right, sell Israel down the river, make a deal and say, well, you got to take this deal. And if you don't take this deal, I'm not going to send any more weapons. I'm not, so that his loyalties could switch very quickly. Now, I don't know, that doesn't seem like a likely scenario, at least to me. I mean, in some ways it's likely, but I think that, oh, my computer's, I'm out of batteries. All right, what can we do? Can you put yours up there? You want to put yours?
Keep going.
Okay, so, yeah, I should have charged. So I think that, there is a likelihood that the war restarts and that Israel continues to try to destroy Hamas. I mean, I think that's, but then, I mean, this is a very difficult question that, I mean, I think you're how do you destroy Hamas? It's an ideology. It's obviously very popular. You think, how did the United States destroy Nazism in Germany? Think about that. Well, I mean, German culture underwent a total shift and there was an occupation for a while. I mean, there's still a huge army base in Germany. I mean, so the United States has essentially been in an occupation position in Germany for 80 years. So is that what Israel and the United States want to do? And I don't think so. So how does that happen? Okay. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Curious what your perspective is on the way Israel somehow came into a situation where we exchanged one Israeli hostage for 20 Palestinian prisoners. This weird exchange ratio has been going on for 25 years.
Okay.
Why did we get to that point?
So I can give you, so this is my, this this is my rabbinic hat instead of my political hat on.
Us. We want to be muted.
Video?
Mom, you have to mute us.
We have no sound, Rabbi.
Keep going.
So it's among the most important mitzvot we can do. And so is Pidyon Shivui. Okay, this is annoying.
I know. Wait. I can do this. I just have to
So-
mute me.
Pidyon Shivui is redemption of the captives. And in Jewish law, it is considered obligatory, important to do everything you can to release hostages, even if it's unequal. So there's a very famous story. It's it's not Talmudic, it's post-Talmudic, but a very famous rabbi called Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg was imprisoned. He was taken by kidnappers for ransom because they knew that, you know, the Jewish community from which he was their beloved rabbi, so they would pay up. And so he was taken to prison, and he snuck a letter to the community saying, absolutely do not pay the ransom, because then it'll just happen again and again, and you'll be broke. And so they still paid, and he still came home. But this has been a big part of Jewish tradition. So in one sense, it's a religious obligation. And on the other hand is what I mentioned earlier about the strategic value of knowing that your country and your government, your army will do everything they can to get you back. And so then it becomes a purely strategic calculation. Does the threat from these prisoners we are releasing, is the threat so great that it warrants not getting hostages back? And then that's just a calculation. I mean, there's probably a lot of different factors. There's probably spreadsheets figuring out, you know, where is this person going? What's their likelihood? What's their history? How do we watch them? I think it's very scientific which prisoners are released. So that would be it's just, you know, it says something beautiful about our culture too, about how much we value every single life. I think about that a lot. You know, this is sometimes when you think about Judaism and there are 14 million Jews in the world, and that's basically would be considered a small statistical error in a Chinese census. I mean, no, seriously, we are so small. So every life, there's a feeling of we will do everything we can because it's part of our family. So I think there's an emotional, psychological component to it too.
We have a question on Zoom.
Sure.
Sandy, go ahead. I unmuted you.
Rabbi, first, can
All
you?
right, wait. Okay. All right, real loud.
Can you hear me, Rabbi?
Sure can.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for doing this. This is important for all of us. Secondly, David and I think about this subject from an Israeli vantage point. We have a grandson in the reserves right now. He spent months in Gaza, months up in the Golan Heights too. And we think that you agree with us on most points, but yet I don't agree with what you said tonight or what you're thinking, because I have no confidence in Netanyahu. He is an evil man. And those people on the southern border there that were taken hostage were not the people that voted for him. They were not from his party. And the army was busy, but they were busy in the West Bank protecting the settlers at the time of October 7th. As far as the hostages returned, they must be returned. We must get them back. And even if we give 1,000 to 1, as they did with Gilad Shalit, they gave 1,000 prisoners for 1 Israeli back some years back. Even if we have to do that, We have to see that these prisoners in the last week that have been released, they are all hailing Hamas as their hero. They think because of Hamas, they got out of prison. Some of them have been in prison for years for small crimes. And they have made Hamas, so we have a lot more Hamas followers now.
Right, 100%. And I think what you're saying, I think a lot of Israelis agree with you that we do everything we can to get hostages back. I certainly don't disagree with that. I think that the broader conflict is, and I think you also bring up an important point I didn't mention, and this is many people in Israel believe that Netanyahu didn't really care as much about the hostages because they're generally on the more politically liberal side, because they were kidnapped from the concert and the border,
Yes.
the kibbutzim on the border are more liberal. I mean, to me, that's extremely cynical, but could be true. I don't put anything bad in politics. Anything's possible. I think that's, I don't know if I don't agree with that. It's that so malicious, but certainly it's possible. And I also think that illustrates a real tension in Israeli society right now. In that there are a lot of people that don't want any deals, that simply want a complete and utter war until Hamas is utterly destroyed, and that any deals just delay the inevitable and make more terrorism likely. And that's a very strong point of view. And I suspect that's probably where Bibi Netanyahu believes, but that politics is politics, and that there is a strong demand in Israel. More than 50% of the population wants some sort of deal because Israel's a family. So that's just weighing different strategic priorities. That's how I look at it. Yeah, Len?
Real loud.
Real loud, okay. So my question has to do with the word that you used earlier, ideology. And how do you fight an ideology? We're talking here, quickly say that we were talking about destroying Hamas.
Yeah.
Destroying Hezbollah. The best recruitment tool that those organizations have is the Israeli army.
Right.
Okay, so how do you fight? I mean, if you kill all the soldiers, the terrorists, the idea is still there.
Right.
How do you
deal
with that?
Well, it depends on what your ideology is.
Okay.
I mean, I think if you believe that this is essentially a set ideology among the Palestinians, and that the only way is to utterly destroy that ideology, then I think, now I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but one could say that essentially encouraging resettlement and some sort of occupation in which Israel runs Palestinian schools and Palestinian social services, and essentially is a kind of occupying force for at least a decade or two to sort of root out. I don't think anybody wants that.
No.
I don't think Israel wants it. I don't think we want it. But I think if you're talking about how do you root out an ideology, that might be the only way. So the other side of that, and this was the dream behind the Oslo Accords. This is what we sort of American Jewish, more liberal leaning, and I think what most of us believe in our hearts, is that a peaceful situation would be best for everybody. It's not that wouldn't you want Palestinians to have jobs that pay well and that can go back and forth between the West Bank? I mean, I remember when I was in Israel, this was 2001, 2002, there was a lot of, when we left our apartment, I gave all the nice furniture to a guy and came out, I think he was from the West Bank, and came and he worked at the school and brought his truck and moved my stuff, and that was that. And there was a lot of back and forth. That doesn't happen anymore. And I think that, like, at all. The Palestinian workers that do still work in Israel, most of them just sleep in Israel. They just stay. They have like special workforce housing. So they don't have to go back and forth through the checkpoints. They may go back on like weekends and things like that. But our dream, I think, was that there would be benefits for everybody. Economic benefits, cultural benefits, educational benefits. And that just That just didn't work. Why didn't it work? Well, identity politics and hatreds are very powerful. They speak to a sort of primitive part of our brain. Kind of, it's similar to what we have in America sometimes with pitting one group against the other. That is a very powerful tool. Yeah, tool is a good word. Yeah, so I think, so I don't know. What do you think? I mean, how do you get rid of an ideology? What do others think? I would love to hear other opinions. There's a smart group of people in here.
We have Diane.
Okay, sure.
Diane, go ahead.
So I've heard proposals of a Marshall Plan, a type of Marshall Plan for Israel and the Middle East and the Palestinians. What are the Arab states? What is their position about this? Are they willing to help rebuild the Palestinian settlements, to help the Palestinians economically? Obviously, I see it from a socioeconomic perspective that if they were, particularly in Gaza, the West Bank is economically better off than the Gazans. But if they were better off economically, there might not be as much unrest.
Well, the West is such a good question and a complex question. And I think that was kind of Netanyahu and others' vision, is you forge certain relationships with Arab powers, and those countries then invest in Israel and in the Palestinian areas and create some wealth, and that wealth and trade is benefits everybody. And that's why, I mean, I heard that President Trump's first phone call was to Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. I think he probably sees Saudi Arabia as sort of the richest country in the Middle East, and if they could get on board with some sort of agreement that could lead to investments, you know, so I think that is a sort of dream that there could be the equivalent of a Marshall Plan. Historically, what's been so difficult about it is that it's a good wedge issue for Arab states. To blame their own problems on Israel, on the Zionist entity, is good politics. So why would you want to fix the problem that helps you get elected? Not elected, or that helps you maintain support? Why fix it? It's kind of like, you know, if immigration is your winning issue, why do anything to address the problem? Because the existence of the problem, making the problem worse, helps you politically. So I think that makes a deal harder. But in an ideal world, yes, there would be tremendous investment. And I mean, look, the Gaza Strip, if you actually look at the pictures, it is a beautiful area. It's right on, I mean,
It's on
the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
It could be like a mini Dubai.
Yes.
But unfortunately, that's not what it's happening.
No.
Yes. Mhm. Yeah. I think that's yes, I think that's true. Yeah, from what I hear, you know, again, I think part of the group that is really the leading group in Syria is sort of an Al-Qaeda offshoot. So it's not, so they are kind of extremists, but from what I understand, the leader has moderated significantly over the last 10 years. So there's certainly potential. I think, I mean, this is part of Israel's dilemma. In some ways, Israel learned to work with strongman dictators, like Hosni Mubarak was an ally of Israel. In sense, we know this guy, he's a thug, he's a dictator, but we know how to work with him. And so, in a sense, Israel has been able to work with strongman leaders. And so they were able to get along with Assad. Obviously, they're not best friends, but it was some sort of stability. I think the fear is, will there be enough stability so that we can have some sort of at least understood relationship? And that's an open question. Yeah.
I think that the question of how do you get rid of
Yeah,
the
this is
idea
what I
of
would guess.
Hamas is really important, because the idea of Hamas has been taught to 5 generations of Palestinians as true and right way to do things. the one example that I know of that might be a good place to look is the denazification program in Germany after World War II. My understanding of it is basically, unless you could prove that you've given up the idea, you couldn't participate in the economy.
Yeah.
And it was very complicated, very hard for some people. But I suspect that the American public would all of a sudden start worrying about free speech. And you know, there was no, there's no rule in Germany for free speech about anti-Semitism.
Right, that's good. So, yeah. Yeah, and American soldiers were in Germany and still are. So, I mean, it took a real huge effort to denazify. And I think part of like the dream was maybe the UN could help achieve that in Palestinian areas, but obviously that didn't happen. Almost the opposite happened. So I think that is the question. How do you de-Hamas Palestinians? And again, that's where I don't see much hope. I'm generally an optimist in everything in life, but this one it's hard to be optimistic about. Yeah.
The other aspect
Yeah.
of this is that Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, yeah,
And the Muslim Brotherhood affects
Yeah.
all of the Middle East.
yes,
And it's as
Yeah.
disgraceful as Hamas is.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, one more question, then I want to get to a little bit more about just sort of general, actually, we'll do two more and then more anti-Semitism. Yeah. So, and then-
There were three elections.
Yeah.
today in Vermont, in Gaza. Wouldn't the people overwhelmingly return Hamas to power?
Yes.
Well, that's a big yes, I think so, but I also think there are some people who are just like, oh, this can't go on. I have no food, I have no water, I have no home. I mean, at some point, reality kicks in. But yes, I think, because there's nobody else. There really is no organized entity. And at least you could say, we're getting some food and we're fighting them off. And they killed, I mean, it's yes. I think, yes, Diane. Very interesting question. Would Netanyahu remain in power? I mean, I don't know enough about Israeli internal politics. I mean, I read them. I think so. I mean, I think that at this point, I mean, Sandy mentioned there are a lot of, he's deeply unpopular among a lot of Israelis, but he's also very popular among others. And say that he's conducted the war well, even if it happened under his watch. So I don't know. There's a chance he probably would. I mean, I think I think once there is a break, if the ceasefire holds, if it reaches phase 2, and there's sort of some more retrospection about how did this happen, then I think he's in trouble. Because I think if people kind of see what led up, just like the chief of the army just resigned,
Yes.
he said, this happened under my watch, I resigned, something like that could happen. But if the war continues, I think he stays in power. And obviously one could then draw the conclusion that he wants to continue the war in order to stay in power. So,
Hear, hear.
That's a sort of a cynical way of seeing it, but very well may be true. So I want to talk a little bit kind of about this sort of rise in anti-Semitism and how it happened. And there was already a lot of anti-Semitism going on. But if you think about what happened, I mean, literally in the weeks, days after October 7th, there were people on college campuses saying this is all Israel's fault. And it was it's kind of remarkable. I think something like 5 out of the 8 Ivy League presidents are gone who were there on October 7th. I mean, it really has had tremendous effects on college life, cultural life, politics, obviously. I mean, you look at what happened in the election. I mean, and I read a really interesting article. I think it was in the Atlantic. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was kind of about why there was so much sort of backlash against DEI and sort of just academia in general. And this person made the argument that if what's being taught at top colleges leads to students praising Hamas, then everything that's taught at those colleges is suspect. That if these are our elites, then they're really full of you know what. So I think, again, I don't know, I've certainly never thought that way, but I think some people might think that way. So then what that suggests is the anti-Israel protests on college campuses had much bigger ramifications for our culture than just being about Jews in Israel. They kind of led to questioning of the university system, of diversity, equity, inclusion, all of things that were very prominent in the election. So I think there are a couple of reasons why, and you're probably familiar with this kind of ideology. It was just becoming popular on college campuses when I was in college, but it really didn't take off until after. This is this idea of the oppressor and the oppressed. That any group, this kind of philosophy is that any group that is in power must be oppressing those who are not in power. So you look at the Middle East and you see this powerful state of Israel, and you see these poor Palestinians throwing rocks, you know, having to go in on hand gliders against tanks and so forth. And you say, well, the oppressor, the powerful, yeah, they must be oppressors. And that is the narrative through which you look at the world. And so that narrative has shaped how people see Israel and how people see Jews. People see Jews as rich, white, you know, powerful, corrupt, money-loving people. And that narrative, that kind of vision has created a kind of anti-Semitic. And that then people ask me, well, how can there be LGBT groups that are aligned with Palestinians? Because, you know, if you lived in Gaza and you were openly gay, you know, get killed. Like, and so and it goes back to that oppressed versus oppressor narrative. That narrative says people who are oppressed have to ally themselves with other people who are oppressed. So politics makes strange bedfellows, as they say. So in a sense, from an oppressor-oppressed narrative framework, the Palestinians and LGBTQ activists are on the same side. Now, again, I don't think all people who support DEI believe this. Probably the vast majority don't. But this is a certain ideology that is taught, and so that helps us explain why there's so much anti-Semitism. And then there is a kind of there is a really wonderful Israeli writer named Moti Friedman. He's written for The Atlantic, he's written for Harper's, he's written for an online publication called The Free Press. And his argument is that there is a sort of core narrative bias in the media. And this goes back to the fact that Western culture, the culture in which all of us live, he says is rooted in a kind of anti-Semitism. That Jews are this sort of eternal villain. That every story, even if it's not totally clear, every story has a good guy and a bad guy, a hero and a villain. That's how our brains work. And that deep down, because Western culture is shaped by Christianity, because it is, remember, what we call Western culture was once the Holy Roman Empire. Remember your history. So Western culture is shaped by Christianity. And Christianity is rooted in hatred of Jews. Now, not, again, modern Christianity has changed. I'm talking about historically. So that essentially Western culture has a inherent villain hero point of view, and that Jews represent the villain, even if it could be unconsciously. It could be unconsciously. So somebody's writing a story about the Middle East, how they frame that story unconsciously displays anti-Semitism. So if you, for example, if you say a headline says Israel bombs hospital, and that's the headline, then you have to go down, and then in paragraph 18, you say, oh, well, you know, rockets were shot from the hospital hours before the bombing occurred. But this Moti Friedman would say that framing of the issue reflects an unconscious anti-Semitism that is endemic to Western culture. And that's really, again, talk about ideology, it's very hard to root that out. We've rooted some of it out, certainly. So our culture is much less you think about clubs that didn't have Jews. I mean, 1930s America, Henry Ford, you think about American history, there's been a lot more anti-Semitism. In general, in American polite society, anti-Semitism is on the decline, has been for a long time now. Again, it ebbs and flows, but in general, that has sort of declined, but it's still there. According to Mochi Friedman, there's still, so that's why he points out that during the Syrian civil war, more people were killed in like 1 month in the Syrian civil war than were killed in all of Israel's history. I mean, and yet, if you look at where newspapers and wired services put their journalists, Israel had like 80 full-time journalists and Syria had about 2. So just the disproportionate attention on Israel reflects a kind of unconscious bias. And that's part of an ideology. And that to me was a pretty convincing argument. It seems, it at least makes sense of something people ask me all the time is why? Why is there bias? Why is there so much attention? I mean, why do people talk so much about what's happening in Israel and don't talk as much about what happens in Tibet or Hong Kong or other places where there's severe, terrible things.
Sudan.
Yeah. To me, and I think October 7th and what's happened since then has brought a lot of that out. Boy, there's so much more to cover because I think we're in a real important moment right now. It's in some way, there's that great quote, forget who said it, but sometimes it says, sometimes history doesn't happen for 7 years, but then sometimes it's something like 7 years of history happens in 3 days, that there are certain moments, periods where things happen that shape the future. These small, like 1789, 1776, 1945, 1948, certain moments where everything lines up. And I think in some ways, we're kind of in one of those moments right now. What does Israel look like in the future? What happens in Gaza? What happens in next elections? What happens? What about the relationship between American Jews and Israel? I mean, I think that itself is really an evolving kind of relationship. I think in many ways, Israel feels closer to more politically conservative evangelical Christians in many ways than to liberal Reform Jews. And yet many of us liberal Reform Jews care deeply about Israel. So there's tension. There's a lot of there's just a lot of questions about what that future looks like. And we can even see it in the Jewish community in America. It's actually fascinating. And if you look at the statistics about how Jews voted in the election, you'll see a couple of headlines that say, well, Jews continue to be major supporters of the Democratic Party, which is true. However, if you look at the changes in voting in New York and in Los Angeles, it is tremendous, the increase in percentage of those who voted more conservative. And so and there's a couple reasons for that. Part of it is just the Orthodox are fast growing. So the Orthodox community is almost, and if I said 80% of Israelis would vote for Trump, 80% of Orthodox Jews would vote. So so the Orthodox community, and then there is a kind of the growth in anti-Semitism has led many American Jews to question, well, what is my future? What do I trust? What do I want America to look like? Who's got my back? I would argue that Biden was an incredibly pro-Israel president. I mean, you can have certain quarrels with a couple of different deals and so forth. And so I think in some ways, the fact that he was president actually avoided some of the greater tensions that might have resolved. But I think that over the next 4 years, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. And I think the American Jewish community may become more divided as well. I hope not. But I already sense it. I mean, I think certainly in just conversations I have. Yeah.
Do you think, I've seen that there's such a confusion with certain words and phrases, just Zionism.
Oh, yeah.
What Zionism means to me and what Zionism means to kids on college campuses who are protesting. anti-Semitism. What does that mean to me versus people who are very liberal and pro-Israel? My idea of pro-Israel is that I support Israel because it's a Jewish state.
Right.
Not that I support necessarily the Israeli government. And so when both sides are going at it, the way that they're using these words they're not talking apples to apples.
No, absolutely not. Zionism is such, I wrote my senior thesis, honors thesis, in college on Zionism, Louis Brandeis and the Zionist movement. I never thought of Zionism as a negative word, but I tell you, I think it was I was doing a discussion for the American Jewish Committee in Chicago, 2014, I think it was, with a Christian pastor. And it was really interesting. And somehow the word Zionist came up and she said, oh yeah, I would absolutely not call myself a Zionist. Even though she was very, pro-Israel, had been visiting, did a fellowship in Israel. And it's because that word was associated with nationalism and ultranationalism. I never see it that way. I see it as simply it's the idea that their Jews should have a state. But I think it is coded in sort of the language of diversity in some ways as nationalistic. And so I think so then, in fact, this is actually a discussion amongst Jewish community leaders say, should we double down and reclaim the word Zionism? There's a Jewish National Fund. I shot a video for them about the words. This was like 2 years ago, about the power of the word Zionism, because they were doing a whole campaign to reclaim Zionism. I think it kind of fizzled. I don't think the campaign worked out. But then there were others who said, you know what? That word Zionism, unfortunately, unfairly, it's been too tainted. We need another word. So there is a debate within the Jewish community about how to think about that. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Well, Mike, okay, one more question. Yes, I could keep going. Oh. Social media. Yes.
General knowledge is very different from what older people. And I think they're very subject to the things that come out of God knows where, websites and all these things. And I think that's been one of the major issues in creating.
Well, what social media does is it encourages conflict. I talked about this in a sermon once a couple of years ago, that there's a whole group of people called conflict entrepreneurs. These are people who build businesses and podcasts and media empires by provoking conflict. Trump's a master. I mean, but there are lots of people like that who are able to generate conflict. And social media is the perfect vehicle for that because it gives you quick headlines. You get a quick burst of dopamine. Someone's as upset as I am. And so that feels good to people. And so I think you're absolutely right. And again, that's something that has really come into people understand that. The people who understood it 15 years ago are the ones who set up the big media empires. Most of us now are coming to understand it, that it's real and that it presents tremendous dangers. I mean, I talk about this all the time with my wife. If I knew now how addicting and harmful social media could be, I would never have let my kids do it at the age, I would never have gotten them a phone at the age we did. That was a horrible mistake. I'm mad at myself about it, but I didn't know it at the time. It's, so the kind of, the conflict that can happen with what we see and how information is processed is real. And I think it changes our brains. So, all right, well, we'll do another discussion again soon. Thank you all for coming.
Give me the one. I just want to say that last week, we were down at Pastor Park's church on the south side. And when people agreed, they were like, amen, and nodding their heads. And I saw a lot of that this evening. So Rabbi said that you'll hear from him again. And it'll be me that sets it up and makes sure that we have this again. While I have everybody here, we do have a program on Sunday. Libby Hellman is going to talk about the Ritchie Boys, and it's about World War II, and these were German translators. And it just so happens that my grandson, Max Leiter, is named after a Ritchie boy, so it's going to be an interesting thing. 12:30 Lox and Bagels, 1 o'clock program. And then the week after that, it'll be virtual, and it's our own Ben Zeller. And of course, when you say our own, that means he's a congregant, and he's talking about AI and religion. You're not going to want to miss that. So if you have any other questions, come see me. Another round of applause for Rabbi.